Okay. Let's take a big, deep breath as we come back into this. Uh, so I've been looking at the chats, and this is hard work. And there are some of you where this is really your first deep dive into some of this, this language, this way of looking at the world, this way of understanding harm and trauma and what we need, and it is overwhelming. That's okay, but also, as Adam has been saying, to take it slow. This is a deep dive. You know, we're wanting to cover a lot of ground in one day, but if it's feeling overwhelming, it's because it is. It's a lot, and it's very difficult to start to combat some of or re-see things that we've spent an entire lifetime not seeing in order to keep us safe and keep us from having to be overwhelmed. And so I think a lot of you, what I'm hearing, what I'm seeing in the chats is the sense of despair. And that is a natural response, but it's also one that I want to talk about a little bit, because our hope in this is to address the despair, and it's understandable, but what we're hoping to get you towards is grief. And grief is different than despair. Some of you, you're starting this work late in life, and so there's a sense of regret. There's a sense of what if there's no hope, or I can't repair with my parents because they're gone, or we don't have relationship anymore. So a lot of that is kind of our natural spin out when we start to see things that we don't want to see. My advice would be to just be curious. Be curious about your response. No judgment, no sense of this is what you should be doing or this isn't what we're doing. And so, wait, hold on a second. Sorry, someone just told me, is my audio okay to everyone? For those of you who have does it sound okay?
Yeah, sounds great.
Okay, sorry. Great. Someone was just saying that it sounded different. Oh, good. Okay. All right. I want to make sure that everyone can hear. So to be curious about your response, because again, your response has a lot to do with your story. And so even how you're responding to considering new ideas or a new way of looking at this work or a new way of looking at your life, how your body is responding. Does it go to despair? Does it go to powerlessness? Does it go to hopeless or shut down? Does it go to activation? That's all something to just pay attention to, and then wonder, how did that response come to be? Right? Because that can also help you start to understand how you've coped and also how that manifests in your current world. Okay. And so what this afternoon, we're going to be talking a bit more of the process. So this morning, we basically took you through and said, hey, you have a story. Just in case you didn't know, you have the hard things that have happened to you, and those things have impacted your life. And we want to start to understand what that is. We are putting your story up against what should have been. None of us have lived in worlds where all 6 of those things were done on a regular basis. I do not parent my children doing offering them the big 6 as much as I would hope. We're not saying that things needed to be perfect in order for you to be healthy. We're also not saying that because things were absent, that means that all of a sudden you are completely broken. And so it's important that we hold that nuance, and also hold the nuance that trauma begets trauma. So we can have a lot of grace for our parents and the world that they were living in that caused them to respond the way that they did to you. We don't have to turn on them. We don't have to call them evil. We are able to hold the tension and grieve the fact that the world that they were responding to also never taught them how to parent you well. Okay? In the same way that you can hold your own trauma of what happened to you and then be able to look at how you're parenting and give yourself a lot of grace, and also be able to grieve in a way to understand, like, how in the world would you know how to attune to your child if no one had ever been attuned to you? And yet there's still impact, but we can look at that while holding the nuance and holding with generosity and grace without letting each other off the hook, if that makes sense. And we'll get more into that later. As Adam was talking about that story with him in the closet, right? That was echoing a lot of the questions that you all had about, like, well, I've held back because I didn't want to hurt my parents' feelings, right? And so there is this sense of our job, our hope with you all is to help you become more resilient and have more capacity to be settled and centered to handle a world that is difficult. We will continue to have trauma. We will continue to do harm. We will continue to receive harm. We're not hoping that somehow that's going to go away. That's not the world that we live in. So how do we then hold impact and the reality of let that sink in, and also understanding that there's nuance happening around us that we can have a lot of grace for. We will get into this afternoon how to move into more of our stories, how to drop into grief, and then how do you start to recover? How do you start to build a more resilient life? How do you start to move through healing so that you can get to this other side? It's not to say that harm will ever be truly resolved, but there are ways that we can learn how to move through those things, which we will do this afternoon. Again, a lot of you coming back from this exercise are feeling dysregulated. You're feeling grief. You're looking at your cards and you're realizing, oh my gosh, I had nothing, or ones or zeros or twos. What does that mean for me? It's heartbreaking. And there are ways to move through them. We would not bring you into your story and into the reality of those things if we didn't believe that there was hope, if we didn't believe there was healing possible. But again, the only way we heal is if we are radically honest about what's happened to us. God is not afraid of the truth, or else God would have written scripture very differently. Scripture is riddled with terrible, horrible stories where people have done terrible, horrible things to one another, to each other. There's war, there's famine, there's genocide, all the things, right? They all are part of scripture. God is not afraid of that part. In fact, it's part of the story, which means we can also believe that there's a God available to us that will comfort as we come to grips with more of what's true about our story. Okay. Adam, I can't see you, but I believe you're here, like the spirit.
Oh, I'm here. I'm here.
Yeah. Anything else that you would want to add?
Sure. I'll add some stuff.
Yeah.
Grief is not very practiced in our modern American culture. it needs to become so. The human heart, like the human body, is built to heal. Like it's designed to be resilient and to heal. And one of the primary mechanisms of healing for a wounded heart is grief. It's not the only one, but it's a primary component of what needs to happen for your heart to begin to heal. However, I saw something in the chat about like, what if I just feel kind of numb, like and disconnected? In many ways, the invitation to healing, it begins with an honest naming, and then it moves into feeling whatever feelings come up. For a time, that may be nothing. There may not be sadness, anger, humiliation, shame. You just may not have access to your feelings. That is data. If you don't have access to your feelings about your growing up years, there's a reason for that. You have disconnected somewhat from your feelings to survive. And so very often it is necessary to do this labor of story work with someone else who can hold your story and engage your heart with both kindness, artistry, and some measure of skill. And sadly, believe me, I know, like for much of my life, I couldn't find those people. And so I felt very alone because I couldn't find anyone to help me in this work. So I say all that to say this: if what you're feeling is numb, there's a reason for that, and it's not something that you can flip a switch and make stop. The path forward, regardless of whether you're numb or you're overwhelmed with sorrow and anxiety, regardless, the path forward inevitably involves other human beings that can provide companionship, care, and witness to what that boy or girl that is you endured. And look, I know it's hard to find them. I know. Cathy and I are working hard on training people to be those guides. But I want you to understand that, like, there's a reason you are where you are. And it's not necessarily because you lack courage or desire or honesty. It could be the opposite. You might have immense courage, immense desire, immense honesty, and yet you are coming up against the limitations of American individualism. You can't do this alone. It's just not how God made us. Even grief, even anger needs to happen in community. So I am aware that that might create as much angst and unmet longing as it resolves. But wanted to say that this is not something that can be done alone. I want to transition now to talking about emotions in the present and how those emotions in the present can usher you into your stories in the past. Your feelings today, this afternoon, Tuesday at 11 a.m. can become cues for story work, What does that mean? Well, consider anxiety for a second. What's anxiety? Anxiety is different than fear. Hillary Jacobs Hendel's a therapist who draws a very helpful distinction between fear and anxiety. And this is what she says. She says, fear is an emotional reaction to the presence of genuine or perceived danger in the environment. So you see a fire in the kitchen, you feel fear. You don't feel anxiety. Anxiety, on the other hand, is what you feel, she says, Hillary Jacobs Hendel says, when you are avoiding important emotions. Come on. That was so helpful for me. Anxiety is what you feel when you are pushing down, not necessarily wittingly or intentionally, but pushing down core unfelt emotions like sadness, grief, rage, anger. So here's a good diagnostic test. If you're feeling something that feels like fear, but you're not in danger in that moment, then you are likely feeling anxiety. And Hillary Jacobs Hendel goes on to say that our experience of anxiety is often linked to early experiences with emotions. For example, suppose that when you were sad as an 8-year-old girl, suppose that your mother always withdrew from you whenever you got sad, or she got irritated by your sadness. What do you think that 8-year-old is going to do with her sadness? She's going to learn to suppress it, push it down, avoid it, disconnect from it. And as a result, as an 8-year-old, the sadness will not be able to flow through her body. What I mean by that is she will not be able to digest it, feel it, and express it bodily. Whatever that particular heartache of that particular day that made her sad, she won't be able to be sad. In time, she begins to feel anxiety whenever sadness bubbles up as a 24-year-old, a 32-year-old. Why? 2 reasons. Number one, her brain has paired sadness with mom withdraws or mom gets upset with me. The brain is, this is very important to understand. The brain is a pairing organ. What your brain does all day is pair things. So sadness for her as an 8-year-old, and believe me, a 6-year-old, a 10-year-old, a 12-year-old, sadness got paired with mom checks out or mom gets upset with me. Second reason that she's going to feel anxiety as a 40-year-old when she actually feels sadness is because she begins to accumulate a reservoir of unfelt sadness in her body because she was never allowed to feel sadness in her home growing up. 18 years, can't feel sadness, can't express sadness. And so whereas as a 40-year-old, she would have been able to process through any one incident of sadness. That's not what's going on in her body, because her sadness in the present connects her to this reservoir of unfelt sadness from her story in the past. And as a result, she feels anxious. So let me say it again. Anxiety is what you feel when you are avoiding important emotions. And please note, the avoidance of her sadness, it's not her fault. She's not making a conscious decision to avoid her sadness. She's an 8-year-old girl with a mom who can't tolerate her sadness. And so avoiding it, it's her only option. But the price that this 8-year-old girl pays for not being allowed to feel her sadness as a 10, 12, 14, 16-year-old girl and digest it and let it flow through her body is that lots of unfelt sadness begins to accumulate in her body. Okay, your body keeps the score. There's a reason that book is so popular. Your body keeps the score. That sadness doesn't go away. Now, there are a lot of reasons that children are forced to push down core emotions like sadness, fear, and anger. First off, many children are told or shown that they're bad or they're weak for feeling sad. And what about fear? Many children receive the message that if they feel fear, it means they're weak, or anger, If they feel anger, it means they're bad. You're not supposed to be angry at your brother or your mother. So just ponder a few questions for me. When you felt fear or sorrow as a kid, were those emotions welcomed by your mother, by your father? And did your parents sit with you in those big feelings and help you process through them? And what about anger? Was there space for you to be angry at your mother, at your father? Now, here's another reason that many of us as adults, particularly if you're a Christian, that we learn to push down our sadness, our fear, and our anger. And the reason is because feeling those three things, sadness, fear, or anger, conflicts with other beliefs or values that are important to us. Oh my gosh, this is a big one for Christians. Let me just take a minute and talk about the relationship that many Christians have to their emotions. If you're not a Christian and you're on this call, you've been likely saved from this, okay? But here's the deal for you Christians. What should be your response when you feel anxiety or fear or sorrow or anger? For many Christians, feeling sadness, like just feeling sad, conflicts with their beliefs about what they should be feeling. They should be rejoicing in the Lord always. You shouldn't feel sad. For many Christians, feeling fear, feeling afraid, worried, conflicts with their beliefs about what they should be feeling. You should be strong and courageous, trusting in the Lord, not afraid. And oh my goodness, for many Christians, feeling anger conflicts with their beliefs about what they should be feeling. You shouldn't let the sun go down on your anger. Sorry, there's an ambulance outside my window. You should be forgiving, not angry. And as a result, when these emotions of sadness, fear, anger, when they bubble up inside of you, you shove them into the basement of your heart because you feel like it's ungodly to feel sadness or fear or anger. This leads to anxiety. Why? Because anxiety is often caused by avoiding feelings that your body is trying to experience and that your body needs to express. If you're angry, okay, because you feel wronged by someone and you shove that anger down because you feel like good Christian women don't get angry, then you are going to experience anxiety because anger doesn't just go away. Sadness doesn't just go away. Your emotions don't go away simply because you ignore them. Now, notice what happens when you start to feel anxiety. Like, how do you tend to respond in your life now? When you get anxious, very often, at least for me, when I'm anxious, I mean, I can't tell you how many times my body has been filled with anxiety and I have responded, not so much now, but years ago, I responded by saying to myself, the Bible says, don't be anxious about anything. But in everything, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. I would say that to myself. Don't be anxious. If you trusted in God, you wouldn't be anxious. It's Philippians 4:6. You're probably familiar with it. And so I'd say that to myself. Stop feeling anxious. Here's the problem with that. All right, you're attempting to do the very thing that's making you anxious in the first place. You're attempting to push your real feelings down. The Bible is far more complex than we want to acknowledge. It is irreducibly diverse, which means it cannot be reduced to a single sentence. Here's what that means with regard to anxiety. Yes, Paul writes, don't be anxious about anything. Yes, it's in there. But do you know that just 2 chapters earlier in Philippians, the book where it is, Paul talks about his own anxiety. He's talking about sending his friend Epaphroditus back to the church at Philippi. And you know what he says? He says, I'm eager to send him so that when you see him again, you may be glad and I may have less anxiety. So look, Paul felt anxiety. Paul felt fear. 2 Corinthians 7, he talks about his fears. And later in 2 Corinthians, he talks about all the anxiety he has about the churches. For many Christians, anxiety is caused by the refusal to own and express the rage, if you prefer the word anger, fine, that lives inside of you. As a Christian, you believe you're not supposed to be angry, at least not that angry. And if you are a female Christian, God have mercy. Like Christian men, we're allowed to have a little anger, but Christian women, they're absolutely demonized by it. If a Christian woman turned over tables like Jesus did, if she expressed her anger bodily, she'd be looked down upon and people would wonder if she was mentally unstable. This is diabolical. I'm using that word very intentionally. That is of the kingdom of evil, truly. Your feelings, A, they matter, and B, they are I'm going to make up a word, cortical, which is to say they happen before the part of your brain that makes decisions comes online. All right. I said all that really to transition to this. Anxiety or whatever other feelings you're feeling are almost always linked to your story, to your past. The past is present. When you feel anxious today, there's a reason for that. All right. And that reason will be found in your story. Some of you are anxious about finances. Some of you are anxious about your 7th grader being picked on at school, excluded from friend groups. Some of you are anxious because your relationship with your parents isn't what you hoped it would be. Now, here's the thing. Consider this. Why do we become anxious about different things? Why are you anxious about your 7th grader and some in your friends aren't? There's a reason that you have big feelings about the things that you have big feelings about. And that reason is rooted in your story. The way I know that is because that's how neurons operate. Your feelings are a function of neurons firing. If you get anxious about X, Y, or Z, that means that neurons are firing related to that theme of whatever it is that's anxiety producing for you. Same thing about anger, same thing about grief, sorrow, whatever the big feelings are. Your feelings in the present are almost always connecting you to unfelt emotions from your past. That can be a gift. That can be a gift. So your feelings, your anxiety, for example, in the present can become a prompt for you to be curious about your story from 0 to 18. It's as if anxiety is a light on the dashboard of your heart that says something's not right with my emotions inside. I've got unfelt stuff in my body that needs tending to. I've got feelings in there that need care, containment, processing, attention. Now, as you become curious about how your emotions in the present are tapping into unfelt emotions from your past, from your story, you will find yourself pondering your growing up years more frequently. And as you think back on your growing up years, one of the categories that can be very helpful to keep in mind is this category that I mentioned earlier of triangulation. Cathy, you can come back on, or at least you can spotlight both of us, because Cathy and I are going to talk for the next 45 minutes about both triangulation, but within the broader category of how do you get closer to your story. So I'm going to teach some on triangulation, and Cathy, you can jump in whenever you want. One of the things that you need to do in life, in my opinion, everyone needs to do is draw a triangle. And on that triangle, you need to write mom, dad, and you. 3 points of the triangle, mom, dad, you, whoever your primary caretakers were. The closeness of the points of the triangle represent the closeness of the relationship emotionally. So if you come from an emotionally healthy family, your triangle will look like this, like mom and dad at the top, and their 2 dots are closer then either one is to you. You're down here. You're the kid. So in other words, mom and dad are closer emotionally, relationally to each other than either one of them is to you. Now, from the little you've heard of my story, what do you think my jacked up triangle looked like? All right, it wasn't isosceles. I was emotionally closer to my mother than my mother was to my father. What did your triangle look like growing up? Were you closer to your mom than your dad was to your mom? Or conversely, were you closer to your father than your mother was to your father? Here's the thesis. If husband and wife are not passionately committed to engaging one another in love and courage and honesty, commitment, in other words, if they're not regularly talking about their relationship and taking responsibility for how they're harming each other and talking through conflicts and like fighting for each other, if they don't have a deep emotional connection, if that stuff's not happening, something called triangulation is inevitable. One of the parents will become closer to you or one of your siblings than they are to their spouse. For example, your father begins to look to you for companionship because his wife is not interested in him. Or conversely, your mom begins to look to you to connect with her emotionally because her husband is not there for her. Now, I understand you may not have been the triangulated child. Okay. But bear with me, because even if you weren't, you need to understand how triangulation was at play in your family. Because it means that one of your siblings was the chosen child, which was actually very hard for your heart. What was your parents' marriage like? You cannot understand your own story without putting language to how emotionally close your parents were to each other. This is very important to understand. You can't understand your story without naming how emotionally close your parents were to each other. Because when there is a failure of connection between mom and dad will look somewhere else for connection, because people need connection. It might be to dad's guitar. It doesn't have to be another human being, but there will be another lover. Triangulation is when one of the children become that lover. Who was the face for your mother, given that your father was not? Who'd your father turn to for connection since his wife wasn't interested in him? Now, triangulation is synonymous with subtle sexual abuse. It's subtle in that this is really hard for people to get their brains around. It is subtle in that there may not have been any inappropriate physical touch. Can you be sexually abused if you were never inappropriately touched by someone? Absolutely. 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 I don't know how much more strongly to say it. You will understand why by the end of this session. In my practice, in my counseling practice, I could speak for Cathy, in her experience, we have found this phenomenon of subtle sexual abuse to be the root of immense torment for people, but it flies under the radar. Oh, how it flies under the radar. Triangulation results in two deadly dynamics. Number one, your goodness is consumed, usually by your opposite sex parent, but it doesn't have to be. Little girls can be subtly sexually abused by their mothers. I've worked with plenty of them. Same for boys with their dads. It doesn't have to be the opposite sex parent, but it often is. But the key to understand is that the kid's goodness, their vitality, their life, it's consumed by one of the parents. Number two, as a result, you are set up to be envied by your same-sex parent. So you're a 14-year-old boy, and your parents don't have a deep and rich marriage. So your mother starts looking to you rather than to her husband for connection. Dynamic number one, the goodness that you bring as a 14-year-old boy, relationally, emotionally, it's being consumed by your mother. Dynamic number two, as a result, your father comes to envy you because he's not fond of the fact that his wife prefers you in many ways. So if your parents were not deeply committed to each other, like on a day-to-day basis, if there was not a passionate love and care and concern between them, if they weren't each other's best friends, then you may know something about being consumed and you may know something about being envied. By consumption, I mean that since your mother knew that her husband wasn't there for her, she began to look to you for companionship, connection. But what do you think your dad thought about that? Do you see the setup? Subtle sexual abuse occurs when a child becomes the object of a parent's affection. When the child becomes the person that the parent starts to emotionally lean on or turn to. And in time, the child is forced to act like a surrogate spouse to one of the parents. It's not a chosen role, it is a required role. Now, this dynamic places an immense burden on the chosen child, but please hear this. The chosen child won't feel a sense of burden at all. On the contrary, to the child, to me, my relation with my mom, it felt loving and sweet and good. Like as an adult, if you were subtly sexually abused, if you were triangulated, as an adult, you will think back on your childhood and remember being highly attuned to that parent that you were in a surrogate spouse relationship with. You'll remember anticipating their needs, reading them well when they were upset, being there for them. You'll feel close emotionally to the parent who is actually triangulating you, close to the parent who is subtly sexually abusing you. But there is nothing loving or caring about a close parent-child relationship when it services the needs and feelings of the parent rather than the child. That's the sentence. Let me just say that again. There is nothing loving or caring about a close parent-child relationship when it's about the parent's needs and feelings rather than the kid. And so I don't know how else to say it. When you have been subtly sexually abused, when you've been triangulated, the nature of your story is that what felt like love wasn't. Now, one of the heart-wrenching realities of children who are triangulated is that it is a frickin' ego trip to come through for one of your parents in this way. In other words, you feel powerful. You feel special. You feel chosen. You feel good. It feels good to be able to come through. Here, let me read somebody else's words instead of mine. This is from a book called Silently Seduced by Kenneth Adams. It's a woman. And she says, my father always had me by his side when I was growing up. I was his little sweetie. He and my mother didn't have much of a relationship, so I was the object he adored. When I was younger, I enjoyed all the attention and closeness. That's a great confession. All right. This woman, quote unquote, enjoyed all the attention and closeness. And look, here, we need to do another seminar on this. There was goodness in it. Okay, there was. But it was also deeply violating because her dad is looking to her, the child, instead of her mother, his wife, for emotional connection. She is the object that dad adores, not mom. And that wreaks havoc in a little girl's heart. But it is not going to feel damaging. This is subtle. This is subtle. You'll feel idealized and privileged. You won't think of yourself as abused. The way I thought about my story is that my mother was the gift God gave me to buffer the violence of my father. The reality is that my mother is far more wicked than my father, and I wouldn't even say my father was wicked. My mother orchestrated a family system in which I, the chosen child, was her surrogate spouse, and my father beat me up because of it. But the way I made sense of my story for years was that mom was like God's gift to me because dad was physically abusive. Like, do you see? I can't heal when my narrative is that jacked up because I can't grieve and I can't rage. And my brain can't be coherent. The story isn't coherent. I don't know why I invited you on here, Cathy, because I just keep going.
It's good. So do you want to finish, like, do you want me to chime in to tell you what's happening on the chat? I feel like a
Go
radio
ahead.
talk host.
I am not reading the chat.
I know. So this is what I'm seeing is that the idea of triangulation is a really helpful idea. It also brings you directly into, well, this is what happened in my family, and what about this, and what about this, and what about single parents, and what about so, and that's good. Every single like theory we bring it, like from a high level, is meant to bring you further into the particularity of your individual story. And so you're asking the right questions. You're saying, well, what about my context? What about my family? That's it. Adam's story is not going to fit your story one-to-one, nor should it. There are how many people? 365 people in this room right now. There are therefore 365 different stories. And there can be similar themes. There can be similar ways of looking at it. What we're encouraging you to do is to do a little detective work as to your family system, right? And so we can give you broad categories of what this often looks like, right? But then your job is to then just be curious and say, well, that's not what my world looked like. So draw whatever map you need to. If a triangle doesn't work, who cares? Like people were talking about islands, because there's so much stuff. I'm like, look, draw a map of an island range. What are those things called that have
archipelago?
Archipelago. That's right. I only know that word because my kids watched How to Train Your Dragon. So draw a map of an archipelago just to give you a sense of what are the connection points. Yeah. So you have a dad, you have no mom, you have 4 siblings and a grandma. Well, draw it out. Yes. And then just start to make links to say, what was this relationship like? What was this relationship like? What was this relationship like? Because once you start to get a sense of what was going on within your family dynamic, you can start to understand where that dysfunction then created different styles of relating that have become maladaptive as an adult. But you just have to start getting curious about it and wondering, gosh, what was the impact? So, and each of us have a different story around that. I was taking a walk with some neighbor friends, and they were asking me about my relationship with my brother. And I'm the older sibling. My brother was younger. We've had a complicated relationship, and I found myself freezing in the midst of talking about it. And I've been doing this work for 18 years. I was like, I felt flooded. I wasn't sure. And I thought, you know what, I may need to do some more work around this because I'm not clear about what happened there, you know? And so that was an indicator to me, like I need to probably arc that out a little bit and understand the dynamic that was set up between me and my brother and what that had to do with my parents. But you can do that work with a lot of curiosity and then start to understand more of what was your role and where was it distorted. And that's why Adam brings you to the big six, because there's a sense of now you have an imagination of what health should have looked like. So you can start to see the subtle differences between what's health and then what was the system that you were in. And how do you start to understand then how you related to that system? Because it's not even just about this is what happened. It's then, well, what did I do in response to it? What was my instinct? How did I self-protect? How did I protect my mom? How did I, like I became, in my family, my role was the fierce protector, right? So if you had asked me 20 years ago, I would have told you my family is amazing. My mom is my best friend, right? That's what I would have said. And again, like my parents are good people and there's been harm that I need to lean into, right? And so part of that was I was unwilling to see what was going on and name my father's rage, the triangulation that was happening, me needing to move into the role of being the perfect daughter in order to hold all of us together and create life and goodness and meaning in our world. My brother was the rebellious one that created chaos, and I could have killed him because he was like messing everything up in our family. Like if only he could have pulled it together and been better, we could have been perfect. Well, what I was doing, I mean, Adam said this in the last segment, I was pushing down all of those emotions, everything I was feeling and seeing, it was going further and further and further down. And what was manifesting in my body? Anxiety, depression, eating disorders, right? All of those things that were happening to me were all because of a system I was unwilling to engage. And guess what? There was also an agreement that I made between me and my parents that said, I will never expose. Right? So we're looking at vows of how that comes into play. Of like, I'm always going to put forward the best version of what's true. Right? And that still happens today. Adam and I were in a meeting last week where my stuff going on in my marriage was being exposed in beautiful, good, really healing, healthy ways. My instinct was to tell everyone to shut up and stop exposing me and things are going wrong. We don't talk about this in public. We don't talk about Bruno. That's from Encanto, just in case you're not sure. Right? And so that's my role in my family, was to be the bearer of the family secrets. And I bore them in my body. So what we're asking is, are you willing to just start to wonder about that? And you don't need to take everything that we've said and then put it directly onto your story. It's not helpful, right? We had a friend who was talking to us and said, look, my spouse and we're having a lot of issues. And I deeply love my daughter, but I think we have a pretty healthy relationship. Is it possible for me to have a healthy relationship with my daughter if my spouse and I are really struggling? And the answer to that is yes. Yes. So it's not always that if your parents have an unhealthy relationship, that means automatically they have an unhealthy relationship with you. Mm-hmm. We're not saying that. As soon as any of this becomes dogma, then we've careened off a way that's not going to be helpful, right? All of this is nuanced. What we're asking you to do is to consider, because oftentimes something that may have felt healthy, you may start to see the cracks of it form as you start to lean further into it. And so we're looking at those different dynamics. Okay, that was my preaching. Got really animated, mostly when I talk about Disney movies. That's like, I'll just talk about it all day. So Adam, that I feel like that kind of covers triangulation. What do you think?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so the question is around triangulation as sexual abuse. This is what I will say about that. Anytime our bodies and hearts are connected with another human being, that where it's not for us, then it becomes subtle sexual abuse. So when our hearts are open as children, our hearts are open, we want care, we want connection, we want goodness. When that is connected to something that is, our parents are indulging, they're consuming, they're using something of our life force for their own, that does something to our sensuality, our sexuality, our sense of our being as a human being. And that distorts something in us that is meant to be ours. Yeah.
At the risk of making you uncomfortable, though you have spoken about this publicly, will you share, which son you would triangulate if you wanted to?
Yeah.
Why?
Okay. It's getting real here, people. This is the back half. All right. Okay, so we're human beings. We have people who connect to us more than others. I have two sons. I have one son that's incredibly attentive and attuned, and he understands the world the same way that I do.
Mm-hmm.
I have another son who is fiery. He has huge emotions. He is wild and untamed, and I like look at him with awe, and I'm also like, I don't know what to do with him. So what will happen is that my older son and I will be handling my younger son. Now notice how I said that. So my older son and I are both in agreement, and my older son is like, Mom, how come my little brother is acting like this? Like, can't he just stop? Like, why is he fussing so much? Why is he so upset? Mom, I'm with you, right? That's our normal engagement, is that it's me and him, not against, but like we're aligned. We have a natural alignment. And again, that doesn't have to be bad. I have to be aware of it though.
Right.
Because if I'm not aware of that, I could easily exploit his tender young heart that longs for an appropriate connection with his mom. Now, if I don't handle that natural loyalty that we have towards one another because we get each other, then it can be something that's exploited.
Right.
And it's not healthy. Right. It's maladaptive. It's dysfunctional, right? Because now it's crossing over a line. Because now I'm moving him into more of an adult space. I'm connecting his body more into mine in a way that is unhealthy, that merges our bodies. Like, it's really subtle. But that's what happens with triangulation that goes, or a natural loyalty or connection with a child that goes unchecked, especially if I'm not aware of getting my needs met by other healthy, functional adults. Because what happens when a kid loves you, there's something beautiful. I have two dogs too. Dogs, when dogs love you, you're like, this is amazing. It's like unbridled. Adam doesn't do dogs, but I have two, and our house is messy and we have hair everywhere. We're a complete mess. But there's something pure about the love a child has for you, a dog has for you. Like, there's something about that that's uncomplicated. And if you indulge that in a way that's crossing over to something unhealthy, then you're hurting them. You're abusing your kids. And that's a hard thing to say, but you are. Because you've moved into a space where they're connecting to you on an adult level that you're asking them to offer you in order for you to feel loved. And that happens more than we'd like to ever imagine. Does that answer your question, Adam?
Yep.
Everyone's like, oh geez. Yeah.
I mean, one way to think of this, and then we can move on, is it's like, take your stereotypical example of a husband who works a lot. He's emotionally disconnected from his wife, and a coworker that he works with really closely is a female, and they become emotionally very close. They're on the road together. Nothing sexual happens. Okay. There's no physical touch, but they have what we call an emotional affair. They're emotionally very connected. All triangulation is that happening inside the home with a child.
Yeah. Okay. So we're almost at time, I think.
No, you have 20 minutes.
Oh, sweet. Okay. Adam, I think we should talk. So we talked about triangulation. That's one thing that we find is often present as we're uncovering pieces of our story. But more than that, as I said, it's the hope that you start to understand the whole of your family system. We're going to bring in a couple of other categories as well, because not all of you have triangulation in your system. And so that was coming up in the chat, right? The idea of, well, what if my parents were like so connected to each other, and then it was almost like a mistake that they had kids, and they were always off, playing bridge or with their friends and dressed up, and we were kind of this afterthought, right? So there are lots of different family dynamics that are present that cause harm, right? And so we're going to talk about a few of those, because oftentimes a huge one that I get in my office, Adam, I don't know if you would agree with this, is the idea, well, my parents weren't abusive, they were just absent. Do you get that?
Yep.
Yeah. So, and Adam touched on this, but neglect is active. Neglect is perfect, or is purposeful. And it has intent, and it also is a result of parents who have actually read you quite well and have chosen to remove themselves from what they're seeing, or they're ignoring what they're seeing the needs of their children being. Adam, what would you say about that?
Here's what I'd say. When you said bridge, my parents are out playing bridge.
Yeah.
There is nothing more alluring, intriguing, and exciting than a child.
Mm.
All right. I don't care if you're building Apple computer, like a child is more intriguing, delightful, life-giving than a startup company, or breaking out as an artist, or Taylor Swift's new album. And I love Taylor Swift's new album. Let me tell you something. I will put my money on this. A child is better than Midnight's. It evokes more emotion, more desire, more life. And I've been listening to Midnight's on repeat for 3 weeks. Okay, it is going to fade. My son and daughter, and I'm an average father. Maybe I'm above average father, but like, and I don't have like amazing kids. I just went to at lunch, I went to my son's basketball game. He'd never shot a free throw in his life. He got fouled. He goes to the free throw line. I turn to my wife. She gets out her phone. And we're like, I've never even taught Eli how to shoot a free throw. He airballed it. Okay. He is my son, and I delight in him. And I am intrigued about how he is developing and who the hell this boy is going to become. Bridge doesn't hold a candle to a child. So if your parents were more interested in bridge, or I don't care if it was bridge or Dell computer, 30 years ago, or cryptocurrency, whatever it is that gets you jazzed. It doesn't hold a candle to the face of a child and the heart of a child. And by child, I mean 6-year-old or 16-year-old.
So let's talk about neglect as active. So I'm seeing some chatter that's saying, how are we meant to believe that our parents intentionally neglected us?
Yes, that is a great I mean, if that's all you leave with today, sorry to interrupt you, Cathy,
Yeah.
that is worthwhile. That question needs to be on a Post-it note on your mirror. It is an excellent question, and there is an answer. There is an
And
answer.
why don't we want to know the answer?
Well, I could put it this way. I had a lot of pain as a 34, 35-year-old, before I went to a recovery week, a lot of pain, but I did not have to feel the agony and the tears and the writhing of my body when I realized that my mother, who I thought was God's great gift to me, was actually abusing me. Like, the reason I get pissed when Cathy tells the skate park story is because that kid Aiden has a mother. And I don't have a mother. And I would trade right now. I'd trade all this stuff I do, my pod, all of it for a mother. It's a holy longing.
Mm-hmm.
That longing is not supposed to go away. I still want a mother. And I still need a mother. And I'm going to be 50 in March.
When we talk about neglect, so if Adam's right, and children, when they come into this world, they bring life there, but there's also a sense of any place where we did not receive care gets exposed when we then try to be available and care for our own children. So oftentimes what happens is that when a child comes into the world, even if it's a sense of like your parents were waiting years to have you, and there was so much desire and so much, they wanted you so badly. And then you have this experience where on one hand, you were wanted so much, and you had the perfect Christmases and the perfect birthday parties, and all of these things were happening for you. And yet you have this insane sense of loneliness and isolation, and a sense of like, there's no one here to actually manage my internal world. I'm on my own, right? That's an indicator that your parents were showing up in external ways, but neglecting your internal world. That happens because a parent sees what's needed and blocks it out because of their own trauma. I don't want to see when I'm failing my sons. It is painful. It is agonizing. And and it takes the best, most brave parts of me to see it for what it is. And that's taken a long time to get there, where I'm willing to look at my own life, my impact on other people, and actually own what's true. And the fact that I really screwed that up. Like the other night, my son is dysregulated in the bathroom because he once the snack time has gone and it's passed, there's no more snacks available. Kitchen's closed. He's missed his window. He's freaking out. He's dysregulated. He's in the bathroom, won't brush his teeth, won't go to bed. I'm so flustered and dysregulated. I closed the door and went downstairs. It's not a bad, I understand why it was probably a better choice in that moment than staying with him in a dysregulated state, right? I needed a minute to collect myself and to be able to re-engage. So I left and heard him screaming and sobbing upstairs and saying, "How come you don't love me?" And so I go back in about 5 minutes later and sit down on the floor and pull him into my lap and start to try to soothe him. Right? So there's something that happens for us that's activated in our own terror where we don't know what to do that impacts our kids. And there was something in me that could see his dysregulation and then walked away because I could not bear what was going on and what I was seeing outside of me. It's easy to see how we come to a place of neglect because we're overwhelmed with our own trauma. And that's when we have language for it. I'm not making excuses for our families, but I'm saying as a kid, you saw that your parents saw you and they chose to leave anyways. That's implanted in your brain somewhere. And the more that we could get closer to that, that you saw they didn't want to be around you. They didn't want to attend to your feelings. It's not that they didn't see you. It's that they saw you and chose to look the other way. That is a more painful aspect of the story. And it's more difficult to get there because it feels like unreal. It feels like, who could do that? And how could my parents have done that to me? When our systems are shut down because of unaddressed trauma, we're not acting out of the best places of who we are. We're flooded, we're unable to settle our bodies, and we're unable to connect. But I knew in that moment that my son needed something different from me, and I walked away because I was frustrated and just could not handle it. Again, I came back, right? But like I'm a fairly healed, attuned person who's done a lot of my own personal work. It is not hard for me to understand how parents have looked away. And neglect isn't just they didn't see me, it's that they saw me and they left anyways. Adam, I'm not sure if you have thoughts about that.
I mean, I can just share a story that comes to mind from my own story. When I was 15 years old, lots of pain, went to a Christian bookstore, bought a book called If God is So Good, Why Do I Hurt So Bad by David Biebel. I still remember the title. It's sitting on my, the coffee table in our family room. It's Christmas time. My dad's brother is visiting us for Christmas, my Uncle Steve. He sees me reading a book and he says, "What are you reading?" I tell him. And he chuckles scornfully when I say the title is If God is So Good, Why Do I Hurt So Bad? And he looks at my father, his brother, and says, "I've been asking that question my entire life." And they both laugh at me, like derisively, contemptuously. The temptation is for me to make sense of my story as my dad was just a crappy dad, or mean, or didn't understand my spiritual heart, that was interested in God. Dad never went to church. Why I was reading Christian books, that he didn't understand that. And that's all true. It's just not what's most true. What's most true is that my dad is making me pay for my relationship with his wife. Because everyone in the family, including my two younger brothers, know that my mother and I are the closest two members of our family and that she prefers me to her husband, my father.
This is a hard topic. The idea of how do you actually look at intentionality? How do you understand what's true, what's most true? This takes years of work and a slowness and a deliberate moving through the stories our question to you for today, if this is the first time you're going through this, is just, will you consider that maybe there's the story that you've always told yourself or that's been told to you about what's
Yeah.
true about your family? And then there's the story underneath.
Yes.
And yes, Brain Talk by Schnarch, you can see it on the back of my thing right there. It talks a lot about this, of like, how do you start to understand a truer understanding of this story? What we're asking you to do is just consider, maybe there's a story underneath the story. And your job isn't necessarily to jump from here to here in a day. That's not what we're asking you to do. In fact, that would be very disruptive and probably not healthy for you to do, right? What we're wanting you to do is just follow the thread of whatever is coming up for you. So as we're talking, is there a story where you say, this story has really always baffled me?
Yes.
I don't understand what was going on here. And this story is told at Thanksgiving as
Right.
one of the hallmarks of our family. It's now mythology, and now you're starting to go, I've never liked it when they've told that story.
Right.
Well, pull that thread. Like, what's happening for you? Because what your experience is cognitive dissonance, where the thing that you think you're meant to be feeling is different than what you're actually feeling. And so will you just kind of be curious and go down and pull that thread? We're not asking you to pull all the threads. Pull one. What is this brought up for you? If you're pissed and you're like, these people are insane, okay, well, let's talk about the loyalty that you have towards your family. Pull that thread. It's a great thread to pull, right? And so you don't have to go into all of it at once. We're just saying, like, will you start to consider one level at a time? Because again, our premise is that the way you experience freedom, capacity to have joy and connection, to be a more healed presence, to spur on your creativity, to be who you're meant to be in this world, which we're image bearers. We're meant to bring something of the living God to bear on behalf of this world. That's what we're meant to do. To the degree we have unhealed embedded trauma, we will not be able to bring the fullness of who we were meant to be into the world in the way we're meant to bring it. That's all we're asking is not so that you can just become angry and bitter and expose your family as being bad. We're saying, look, you have embedded pieces that have not been healed that are wreaking havoc in your life. Maybe it's time to pull some of those threads and start to actually heal those parts so that you can love people more. You can be more whole. You don't have to struggle with anxiety and depression. I'm not saying that those things just go away, but you'll start to understand the why. And when you have the why, there is something about you that it's hard, but you feel more settled. It's heartbreaking, but your body already knows the why. It's already in your body. We're just saying, maybe there's a way to connect your left brain to the body that already knows the answer to the why. We're at time. I do want to talk just briefly, 1 minute, about another thing that often gets miscategorized, and that's violence. So you have triangulation, subtle abuse, you have neglect, that's often difficult to look at. And then you have violence. Oftentimes, what people will say to me is, my parents were disconnected from me. There was never an emotional engagement. And when I start leaning into those questions, often what will come up is that the emotional engagement was around violence. My dad never talked to me until I did something wrong, and then he would spank me. Or he would hit me across the face, or I would get beat. Violence is an emotional and arousing engagement.
What do you mean by arousing?
We don't have time for this, but I'm going to go anyways. This is the next level of this content. Violence brings our body online. And when someone is participating in violence against us, their bodies are alive and awakened and aroused. That does something to our psychological being as children. When we see life is happening between us and a parent around violence, and it deeply impacts how we operate in the world. Again, this is the 501 level. It's called arousal structures. I think I have some videos on my website about them, but it's just important to start to understand our bodies are meant to become alive, and they become alive according to whatever is offered to them. And so if violence was the way that you engage with a parental figure, that's something that you want to start to look at, because there are ways of engaging around violence that have impacted your way of relating and engaging to the world today. Okay. I know we don't have time for arousal, but I had to just bring it in for just a second. I'm like Oprah Winfrey around arousal. You have arousal. You have arousal. Anyone who's heard me talk, this is my favorite thing. And we may be able to explore this more at some point, or maybe we'll just have a separate conference just on arousal structures. Well, you and Jay do one on that, right?
No.
Oh, okay. Well, we'll do another. Okay, those who are asking, my website is cathyloerzel.com. And I have some video links and things on there if you want to look at them. Arousal structures are also talked about inadvertently through Brain Talk if you're wanting a book that will help you move through some of this. Okay. What are we doing?
We were taking a 15-minute break so that
Got it.
so that our bodies can recalibrate. When we return at 1:30 Pacific, Cathy is going to talk about what healing looks like. Let me just underscore what she said when we returned from lunch. We wouldn't do this if we hadn't experienced some measure of healing in our own lives by looking at our stories and seeing lots of other people experience healing from very traumatic stories in their own lives. So when we return, it might be a little bit more fun because Cathy is going to lay out some of what it looks like to begin to experience some healing. And I will pivot off that, particularly with regard to how we engage God in these things. So you only have 12 minutes, but you do have 12 minutes. We'll see everyone back here at 1:30 Pacific.